Research Institute of Lecture. We are very pleased today to invite a distinguished guest, Professor Thomas Cavalier. He's now Executive Board Chair, Japan Renewable Energy Foundation, and former Director General of the Swedish Energy Agency. And he's also currently a professor at University of Chalmers University of Technology, Yotemori, Sweden. So he will talk about today about peace, sustainability, and renewable and nuclear.
Thank you. And often I like to talk more about the solutions than the problems. I will try to talk a bit about the problems, but my main focus over the last few years has been to work on the solutions to global energy supply needs and the threats and negative consequences of the old types of electricity supply that we've had. But contrary to what many people believe, if we look at what is happening in the real world when it comes to alternatives to fossil fuels, we have already started globally a very fast increase in renewable supply of electricity, whilst the investments taking place in nuclear energy is comparatively small. And this is something that tends to be well known in the countries who are leading in the world in investing in renewables, but countries like Japan, and for that matter Sweden, with a strong nuclear history and a strong nuclear industry, we tend to believe that it is the nuclear industry that is really developing in the world. But as you can see in this diagram, for the investments taking place over the last 10 years in the world, the investments in solar and wind has increased much more than nuclear. And still, this is a diagram showing the gross investments, how many new plants are being built. And whilst there are very few wind power plants or solar plants being closed, when it comes to nuclear, the number of closed reactors makes the development negative if you look at the net effect, if you deduct the closed reactors. Because since 2003, at least, the number of reactors has decreased, and last year there was in gigawatt -7 gigawatt of nuclear capacity globally. The most remarkable increase in renewable electricity production globally has been this development of wind power. And here you see the curve showing how the installed capacity, the total capacity of all the windmills that are operating in the world, has increased from 1980 to last year. And this curve is so steep that I dare say that there are at least no written or documented projections from the 20th century illustrating a more steep growth. No one predicted that wind power investments could be as fast in the coming century as they have proven to be. So why do I dare to say that? Well, first of all, because I've asked about 5,000 people in different audiences, and usually people who are very knowledgeable about wind power and energy policy and energy modeling, if they know of any publicized scenario from the last century that shows a steeper curve, and no one does. And the other is that there is an explanation. Sorry, it was not the next picture. There is an explanation that I will give you soon. The other technology that is growing very quickly is solar PV. And solar PV, as you can see, is growing so fast that almost half of all the solar PV panels in the world have been produced in the last 12 months. almost half of all the solar panels in the world have been produced in the last year. Very few industries have such dramatic growth. And if you look at this curve, you have 240 gigawatt total installed capacity, and the rate of increase is approximately 40 gigawatt per year for the last couple of years. If you look at solar, it's approximately 70 gigawatt, and the rate of increase was 30 gigawatt of capacity installed last year. And taken together, they will sometime this autumn be larger than the total installed capacity of nuclear in the world. I just assume we had the 240 at the beginning of the year, and this year it will increase as fast as it did last year, and the same for solar. You get 280 plus 100, that's 380, whilst the total nuclear capacity was 370, and it won't change much in this year. So sometime during this year, solar and wind will have a larger global electricity production capacity than nuclear. Of course, one should be aware that this does not mean that wind and solar immediately will produce more electricity throughout the year, because this is the generator capacity, and the generators of wind power plants only produce electricity when there is wind, and that means that you get something like 2,000 or 3,000 full load hours per year, whilst a good working nuclear reactor, when it really works well, may produce its top capacity during 7,000 or even 8,000 hours per year. But that time will also come when solar and wind produces more. Well, this curve was, as I said, steeper than anyone anticipated, and if you look at the individual countries that have built most wind power, you also see the explanation why no one predicted that growth would be as fast as it has been during the last decade. And the explanation is that you see in this curve that China is now number one in the world in total installed capacity, and is number one in annual installations. China built more wind power capacity last year than Europe and the United States taken together. So that's the dramatic shift in Chinese energy industry over the last few years, that wind has become the dominating new renewable source of electricity. And no one in the last century expected China to be the leading country in green, sustainable energy development. We tended to underestimate the rate of development in China. We believed they would go for coal and maybe nuclear, but few dared to believe that China would be number one in sustainable energy. You also see here that the US is number two, and Germany is number three, Spain number four, and India is also coming up on the top 5 list, simply because it's a big country, and they have also discovered that wind power is a cheap source, a low-cost source of electricity that is now being developed quite quickly. Another illustration of the Chinese development is to show that the total capacity now in China is about 80 gigawatt, and the 20 gigawatt installed last year is, once again in generator capacity, larger than their total capacity in all their nuclear reactors. And the first half of this year, wind power produced more electricity in China than nuclear power. Yeah, that was that. Sweden, where I have worked for many years, and for the last few years as Director General of the National Energy Agency, has fought a competition with Japan when it comes to wind power installations. And I have had contacts in Japan for 15 years or so, so I was well aware that during the 1990s Sweden was ahead of Japan. And then in the beginning of this century, Japan overtook Sweden, and for many years had more wind power installed than Sweden. And then when I'm in a good mood, I point out the correlation, not necessarily a causality, that when I became Director General, the installations increased. So last year, Sweden once again passed Japan in total installed wind power capacity. That's when I decided to change team and come to Japan and help Japan regain the top position of the two. But then, of course, Sweden is a small country, so when we do comparisons like this, we always like to do it on a per capita basis, per inhabitant. And then getting Japan to overtake Sweden will be somewhat more challenging. But you see here that you can, as we've had in Sweden, have a fairly fast increase in the production of electricity from wind power. In Sweden, over the last couple of years, there has been one fairly large wind power plant built every day throughout the year, which has resulted in this increase in electricity production. In China, they built more than one wind power plant per hour, day and night throughout the year. That's the rate of investment in China. The reasons why wind power has become so popular in many countries in the world is that we do not only have what used to be the main driving force, that some countries wanted wind power and subsidized the construction of wind power plants. We also have the industrial learning, meaning that the more experience we have gained from wind power construction, the lower the cost has become. So now the investment cost for a wind power plant is significantly less than €1 per megawatt, 1 million euro per megawatt, and you can see that the cost decrease has not been continuous. There's been a couple of years here where demand has been very high, so prices have been high, but the prices have fallen dramatically in the last couple of years. But when I say this is dramatically, well, is it? It's a significant decrease, but how dramatic is it? Well, it becomes even more interesting if you take into account that while I did show the cost decrease per installed megawatt, at the same time, the quality and the efficiency of the wind power plants have improved. So with this example from Siemens delivered plants, the annual electricity generated by a 2.3 megawatt turbine that Siemens designed and sold in 2002 is significantly less than the 2.3 megawatt turbines they deliver today. You get almost 50% more electricity per year with the same generator capacity, and at the same time the generating capacity has become cheaper. So for the investor, this has become a significantly better investment than it was 10 years ago. This was comparing two annual models of wind power plants designed different years with the same capacity. Another development that is important when it comes to fitting large production in a limited area of land is that wind power plants also have become larger. This is now the largest wind power plant in Sweden. It's a 4 megawatt turbine, and you can see that compared to this 10-year-old 500 kilowatt turbine, it is a very big piece of equipment, but with a limited space available, it produces a lot more electricity. And you can also say that with the high towers of the large turbines, you also often get more full load hours per year. So that also contributes to increasing the electricity production per installed megawatt. The solar PV development was sharp, and you have another set of countries in the lead of solar PV installations, and here Germany is by far the leader in installing solar PV panels. And this is this was for many years driven by very generous feed-in tariffs for electricity from solar panels. So Germany was installing a very large share of the total solar PV cells produced in the world. Many of them were produced in China, but they were installed and paid for by Germans. And this is now so shockingly successful for the Germans that they are going to have to pay more money to the owners of these solar panels than they had anticipated when they set up their subsidy scheme. It's going to be expensive for the German consumers, but what the Germans have done is that they have made possible the industrialization of solar PV production, and as I will soon show, the prices and cost for production of solar PVs has really decreased in the last couple of years. The price reduction has been in the order of 50 to 75% in just a couple of years, which is totally changing the expectations for the future development of solar PVs. Everything will now come faster and at a larger scale than anyone had anticipated. Of the slides that I'm showing, this is the only one where Japan is on the top 5 list. You see Japan is number 3 here in installed capacity, and Japan might very well and will probably even stay on this list with a feed-in tariff system that has just been introduced here as well. This is one illustration of how costs have come down, and you can see there was a short period here where prices did not fall, but then, as I mentioned, they have fallen very rapidly in the last couple of years. And here it's a logarithmic scale, so if you had a linear scale, it would be even more dramatic. Here is one linear, given the prices of crystal silicon PV. Well, the individual cells in China, and you can see a price decrease from 4.5 to 1. I think the unit here is $1 per watt during the last couple of years. So it's really here subsidies in Germany bringing down the cost for all customers in the whole world. The Germans have really done a heroic deed for the whole world. You can describe it as one of my German colleagues did. He said that this was the most efficient foreign aid project in Germany ever, because the German consumers paid for PV production to become industrialized low cost, and now these low cost PV panels are available for all the poor people in the world who do not have an electric grid but can get low cost electricity for lighting and communication, which would not have been available to them unless the Germans had done this. One of my British colleagues, he also described this heroic effort by the Germans, and then he said, "We forgive them everything." And when a Brit says that about Germans, it's a good thing. I mentioned that China was the main producer of PV panels in the world. For long, they were just producing and exporting to mainly Germany. But last year, when prices fell, they suddenly decided they should install the PV panels to also contribute to the electricity generation in China. So this is the result of that little decision. You have the quarters of 2011. This is the first 3 months, the second quarter, the third, and the fourth. And you can see that most countries don't change their installation very much. Japan increased a little bit, India increased a little bit, China increased a lot. About a 15-fold increase in the rate of installations of solar PV panels in 1 year, from quarter 1 to quarter 4. Also rare dynamics in any product market. In Europe, the efforts to support introduction of solar PV panels has led to the result that in 2011, the largest new electricity source, new capacity of all electricity sources was solar PV. So the increase in electricity generating capacity from solar PVs was about more than twice as much as for wind, which is number 2. And then you have natural gas-fired electricity power plants as number 3. Biomass, coal actually increased. I think it was only 1 plant. Hydro increased, oil decreased, and nuclear decreased a lot in Europe last year. These are the net figures. So the new built minus what was decommissioned or closed. And this is the kind of figure that most people, even in Europe, would expect could be possible sometime around 2020. It's just that it's already happened, but few people have noticed. I said Germany was the driving country in solar PVs. Still, solar PVs is still a small contributor to German electricity and of the renewables, and this is only the renewables. You have hydropower that has not increased very much, just a little. You have wind power that has increased quite a lot. Biopower and bio-wastes of different kinds have increased a lot, and solar is just on the top. But you see it's a dramatic increase. And this in Germany is a deliberate effort to substitute the nuclear reactors that they have closed. And from 1990 until 2010, they increased the renewables by about 90 terawatt hours per year. And at the same time, they closed nuclear capacity that otherwise could have delivered about 70 terawatt hours. So they've increased the renewable electricity generation more than they have decreased their nuclear generation. In Japan, you've done it the other way around. You closed down a lot of nuclear reactors. You have not yet increased the production of renewables, which means that especially gas is used quite a lot here. And this is the share of renewables in the German electricity supply. You can see how quickly it has increased as percentage of the total electricity, and particularly remarkable is the last little jump from 1/5 or 20% of electricity generated last year to a quarter or 25% of the electricity generated the first half of this year, of 2012. Sweden's greatest achievement in renewable energy has been not the wind development that I showed earlier, but the increase in the use of biomass. And biomass use in Sweden is almost entirely a matter of utilizing residues. We are not planting energy crops or using grain to produce automotive fuel or anything. That's negligible in the total utilization of biomass. So what is being used is residues from the forest industry, residues from the food industry, residues from forestry and agriculture, and waste of different kinds. And by introducing this not via subsidies but via taxation on fossil fuels, we've had a development that has been intensely competitive between different providers of biomass for energy purposes. And the kind of low-cost sources of biomass that have been discovered in this process of competition between different suppliers has surprised everyone. No one projected 20 years ago that we could have such a high share of biomass of our energy supply without having large-scale plantations of energy crops. We have been much more successful economically as well as environmentally in utilizing residues than anyone had predicted. And that is due to a very open competitive market where anyone who can provide biomass at low cost have been given the chance to do so, and substituting fossil fuels. So the use of biomass today makes up almost 1/3 of the total energy use in Sweden. It's the largest source of domestic energy use, biomass has passed oil when it comes to how much energy it supplies to the Swedish society. It's about 50 gigajoule per capita, or on average 1.7 kilowatt per capita. And this figure actually, it's approximately the same as the use of coal in China per capita. A few minutes on Japan. The feed-in tariffs that were introduced this summer are, from a European perspective, extremely generous. The amount of money offered to suppliers of various renewable electricity is very generous compared to the costs we see in Europe. When I show this table to people in the Swedish energy industry, they tend to laugh. In Sweden, there are windmills being built when the income they expect is 4 yen per kilowatt hour for the electricity and 2 yens per kilowatt hour for an electricity certificate, that is the way of supporting renewables in Sweden. So the total income for the owner of a wind power plant now that they now expect is 6 yen per kilowatt hour. And people still invest in wind power and make a profit. And when they see that here you can get 23 yen, they believe Japan must be heaven on earth. But I do realize, after talking to people who are trying to build wind power plants in Japan, that the reason why you need such a high tariff is that it's very difficult to build a wind power plant in Japan. The permission processes are very tedious, and unlike Europe, you still have a power industry that consists of regional vertically integrated monopolies. And if you want to build a wind power plant to compete with the existing power plants, you have to be allowed to connect to the grid controlled by the company that also owns your competitors. And in general, very few people will invest in an industry where the competitors control the distribution of the production. And investors here do feel a little uncertainty because of this, and they also experience that it is difficult to get the connection and the right to deliver where and when they want to. So that's one reason. Another reason is lack of experience. With more experience, everything will be lower cost, faster, more predictable. So most likely the costs will decrease, the profitability will increase even more. So I think already you can make significant profits even with the Japanese costs, and you will have to adjust these generous tariffs downwards quite quickly. But we see that installations in solar PV plants have started, and people expect to make significant profits on solar PV. The permission processes are not as tedious for solar PV as for wind, geothermal, biomass and so on. And let's hope that the other investments are also successful, and you can start bringing down the price and the cost quickly and still get a rapid development. Because there's one other problem with these high tariffs, and that is that people believe, when they see these high tariffs, that renewables are expensive. And renewables are not necessarily expensive. If you look at the wind power plants built in Europe, they are the cheapest way of achieving new electricity generation. There's no other way to get cheaper electricity. And it should be the same here if all these processes surrounding the investments were reasonably efficient. You have what one could call homemade costs that are not necessary but are due to bad regulation and bad traditions and a lack of an open, transparent market. But if you see tariffs like this, you tend to believe that they must be expensive, but they shouldn't. And some people understand, and this is, I think, a quite interesting set of articles over the last few days in Japanese media, publishing in English, I must add, because that's what I can read. You had Masayoshi Son speaking at one conference, clearly stating that he saw the zero nuclear, more renewable option as the most economically favorable. And the planning minister, here presented as Minister of Economy, Motohisa Furukawa, also saying that totally eliminating nuclear and going for renewables would be the economically most beneficial option. And then to my surprise, I found this article where suddenly the Minister of Defense enters the debate, saying that Japan needs to keep nuclear power to prove that Japan has nuclear weapons capacity, which is necessary to deter neighbors from being nasty to Japan. Somewhat surprising. And then within 24 hours in a Korean English newspaper, you see a Korean saying that now South Korea needs to consider acquiring nuclear weapons because now even Japan is talking about it. And I do get a little bit worried when I see this development, because if this would become real, you would have a quite uncomfortable situation. When we were worried in Europe 20 years ago about a war by mistake between the Soviet Union and the US, the sort of time scale was that you had 20 minutes from when you believed the enemy had sent a nuclear weapon towards you to sort of sort things out and decide it was not serious. If you'd had it between Korea and Japan, you would have some 20 seconds, and that would not be sufficient for any regret or correction or diplomatic process. So this is not fun. But there are problems with nuclear, you know, accident risks, nuclear waste, weapon proliferation issues. And just to end here and point at some of the real political nuclear issues. It is not an important issue to decide what a coming government in 2030 is supposed to do. That is something that anyone can enjoy discussing, because they know whatever the result is, it won't affect them, because it's 20 years into the future. I understand that the nuclear industry and the politicians and so on in Japan find that is a very good topic for public discussion, because whatever is decided, it won't matter. But what does matter is what you decide you're going to do in the coming weeks and months, and in particular, such decisions that have direct economic implications for the power companies and in particular then the nuclear power plants. The global issue on nuclear power as a carrier of materials, competence and equipment for acquiring nuclear weapons, what your Minister of Defense thought was a very valuable component of nuclear power, is in a global context anything but a value. It's just a global threat, and discussing to what extent that should be accepted is of course always important. But maybe today the most interesting issue is to find a solution to the issue: who is actually going to pay for nuclear accidents. The nuclear accident at Fukushima clearly proved that the power companies who can afford to build and operate a nuclear reactor cannot necessarily afford to pay for the consequences of an accident. And as companies know that in practice they will not have to pay, they don't have to bother about these risks, because they know that when something happens, they just call upon the government and the taxpayers to come in and pay what's necessary. And that is no good. It's not only a matter of having the obligation to pay, you must have the capacity to pay. One little term that we discussed a few days ago here, when people were criticizing the Japanese idea of stress tests of nuclear reactors, which was just relying on the same methodology as was used when Fukushima Daiichi No. 1 was given extended permission to operate just a few weeks before the accident. What's really important is not a technical stress test, but actually a financial stress test. Can the companies pay in case there is an accident? If they pass that test, it's more interesting to allow further operation of reactors. But then you shouldn't forget that there are expected deaths also from routine emissions, not only from accident emissions, and we have long-term problems with nuclear waste that is not really solved. Once again, there is in Japan a perspective that the nuclear waste is valuable. You can produce nuclear weapons, you can produce new nuclear fuel for new reactors and so on, and sometimes even nuclear waste is considered to be an asset. Whilst in most countries of the world today, we have realized that is not the case. The nuclear waste management will be a very large cost that will have to be paid during the coming 100 years or so for proper management of the waste. And there are few countries or companies in the world that have accounted for these future costs today, and they are therefore not included in the publicly announced costs or prices for nuclear electricity. Yeah, that was the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before opening the floor for question and answers, let me ask a couple of questions first. And first, I would like to ask you, based upon your experience in Sweden and Japan as well, and actually nuclear power phase out is starting from Austria, Sweden, and other Europe. And but I'm wondering, can really nuclear power phase out become global basic or not? And second question is, I like your idea is financial stress test, and we need also environmental stress test and social test, peace stress test. And but what is really needed? Institutional framework. What kind of institutional framework would be needed for effective energy shift from nuclear to renewable? Those two questions.
When I was young and there was an intensive nuclear debate in Sweden, the perception was that nuclear was the only realistic alternative to fossil fuels, and fossil fuels were about to run out, and therefore we were forced to go to nuclear. And with that perception that going into nuclear power supply was not something that you handled because it was the most economical, but it was a necessity. Rational thinking was somehow lost. It comes in particular to the management of nuclear accident costs, where there was even a Swedish public government committee that wrote that because of this necessity to use nuclear, we had to accept the accident risk at any cost to provide electricity. And this idea that you're ready to pay at any cost, pay however much to get the electricity, is for most economists rather stupid, but it was fully possible to publish in a government committee report because of this idea that nuclear was necessary and then costs did not matter. Since then, and in particular over the last few years, it has become obvious that renewables now have the capacity to supply electricity at the same order of magnitude that's necessary, not only to substitute the remaining nuclear, but also to in the longer term, supply most of the electricity and other energies that society needs globally. So it's now obvious that we have an alternative. We don't have to say that the only two things we can choose between is fossil fuels or nuclear. And that's extremely important, because that means that we can start being rational and economical and think about the ethical aspects and the distribution aspects of different sources of energy. Then if you want to sort of get a little into that, then basically there are no sources of energy or electricity production and so on that has no costs or no social effects or environmental effects. They're all having environmental effects, but the renewable sources can be managed so that there are no long-term irreversible effects. But you will always be able to see wind power plants and solar panels. They cannot be made invisible, because then they don't work. I have never heard of any idea of how to make wind power plants invisible or solar panels invisible. You will see them. So if you think they're beautiful, it's just a positive thing. If you think they're ugly, it might be negative. But it will affect you living at the same time as you can enjoy the energy that they deliver. And that's a distributional difference that's quite important compared to fossil fuel and nuclear, which both have almost unavoidable long-term negative effects that will harm future generation without giving them any benefit from the electricity production. So that's one example of a sort of ethical aspect that should be given consideration when you choose how to assess the economics of different sources. And when you ask for international institutions that would guarantee or manage the global avoidance of nuclear power and the nuclear power risks, I think such institutions are not easy to build, and it would be a real challenge, especially if you intend to try to use these international institutions to force countries or people who want something else not to realize what they want, because then you will also interfere with the independence of individual countries. But what is now also becoming globally easy to see is that nuclear power is becoming so expensive and no longer competitive that it will be very difficult for individual countries to claim that they are building nuclear power plants to get electricity only. So I think when where am I now in my, when the Japanese defense minister said what he thought, I think that there are many other ministers of nuclear power countries in the world who think the same but don't say it. And that has been the case in many countries developing nuclear power over the years. And it was definitely the case when the Swedish nuclear power program was launched in the late 1950s. It's easy to document afterwards that the reason why there were such an enormous amount of government money going into nuclear power development was that it was seen as a way of acquiring the capacity to also build nuclear weapons. Right. And if the economics becomes so clear that no country can claim that they're actually building nuclear reactors for energy purposes, so it's obvious that it's a matter of acquiring nuclear weapons, then the establishment of such international institutions and trying to control the proliferation of nuclear weapons will be much easier. And we're almost there. I showed Masayoshi Son and the minister, planning minister, or whatever his correct title is, that they agreed that renewables was an economically better option. We had the managing director of General Electric, being one of the few companies in the world still offering to sell nuclear reactors, saying in an interview in the Financial Times a few weeks ago that it is now hard to justify nuclear on economic grounds, very hard. And he predicted that most countries would go for a combination of solar or wind and gas. And with a few more statements like that, it will be quite obvious that nuclear power is not for economic reasons. Mm-hmm. And then I think the opportunities to avoid further nuclear weapons proliferation will be a lot greater.
So the problem is not only energy, but also economics, environment, and also peace and security.
Yep.
That's beautiful. Okay, now any questions and comments? And I would appreciate you identify yourself briefly. And
Thanks. Hello, I'm Julian Coe. I'm in the Natural Science building. I teach chemistry there. It seems as though you were saying that in Japan the nuclear generators and other electricity generators, nuclear and gas, perhaps they own the distribution networks. And you were saying that it doesn't seem to be the same kind of problem in Europe. Is that because the generators do not own the distribution network in Europe? And how would you go about dealing with that issue? Because that's going to be one of the biggest issues, the political issue of how to nationalize the distribution network. What would you see as possibilities in that direction?
Yeah, the formal ownership issue is a little different in different European countries. But in the Scandinavian countries, we had a very clear cut. So we took all the transmission grid and removed it from the power companies and made it into state-controlled transmission grid operators. So the investment decisions in the transmission grid and all the decisions on how the flows of power should be allowed to go is made by an independent transmission system operator who is not owned or controlled in any way by any of the different power producers. And that is quite important to have rational investment decisions made so that you get away with bottlenecks, and it's important to get a fair treatment of all the competing companies providing electricity in the grid. You're very far from that in Japan with the vertically integrated and also regional monopolies. It appears as if the investments that have taken place in transmission capacity in Japan has not been rational from a national point of view, but these companies have invested also to defend the value of their own production capacities. So there are enormous opportunities for improvements in the Japanese system. And Japan has had among the highest, maybe the highest electricity prices in Asia, because monopolies do not get very efficient. That's experience from all sectors in all countries in the world. Competition can change that. So you wouldn't like to see a national transmission company here in Japan as well, if you want fair competition and better efficiency in investments. There are obvious opportunities now because the power companies are in great need of money because they are operating at a loss, and the government could say, okay, if we're going to save you by giving you money, you should give us the transmission grid. And in that way you could establish a national transmission company that then could facilitate a competitive, efficient electricity market. Of course, when you say that to people who have been in the Japanese electricity sector, they say it's totally impossible. But when I was recruited for this position in Japan, I was told that they wanted someone with blue eyes, ignorance of Japanese traditions, and ruthless rationality. And I say I can guarantee blue eyes and total ignorance of Japanese traditions. I can hope that I can perform with some rationality as well. And I think this is an example where it actually helps to see that it is not impossible just because many Japanese believe it is impossible. It's still possible. You just need to change some things. And the economic benefits of actually changing are enormous.
Okay. Yes, questions?
Hi, my name is William Voss. I'm teaching international relations here at ICU, and I'm very interested in these energy issues. I missed the first 15 minutes, unfortunately, of your talk, but my question is, so Europe has round about 20 years of experience of reorganizing its energy grid, reorganizing the production of electricity. To what degree are European individual governments or the EU itself collaborating or advising or helping the Japanese government, METI, or maybe even individual power companies right now, or do you see this going to be changing, and do you see that there's more influence in the future, especially given the specific European experience over the last 10 or 20 years? Thank you.
Well, there are many people in Japan who are interested in what we have learned in Europe, and that's the reason why I am here. That's the reason why many other European experts have been in Japan talking about the European experience, and there are lots of Japanese delegations going to Europe at the moment. So there is quite a bit of exchange of knowledge and experience and ideas, which I think is very encouraging. Then of course I think it would be a lack of ambition if you just try to copy. You should try to improve also, and that means that I don't think that any European country could come and say we have found the perfect solution. I don't think the Scandinavian countries have the perfect solution. We have not managed to support solar PVs in the clever way that the Germans have done. But on the other hand, the Germans shouldn't claim that they are perfect either, because they are now running into a cost trap with very high expenses for the consumers. So Japan should look at what is being done in other parts of the world, also China, also North America, and learn not only from the good examples, but also very carefully learn to avoid the mistakes. There was an old German, Bismarck, who said that some people say they learn from their mistakes. I prefer to learn from those of others. Which is quite good when it comes to large financial sectors like the power industry and warfare and other things where mistakes are expensive.
It's a big Japanese case to be done. Okay. Okay.
Hello, my name is Sarah and I'm from Sweden. You presented all these positive trends in renewable energy with solar and wind, but still, correct me if I'm wrong, we live in Japan where 30% of their energy takes from nuclear plants or reactors. So I was wondering, what do you think we need to establish to create a society here in Japan based on renewable energy?
Well, first of all, you said that 30% came from nuclear. That was the case a couple of years ago, but now there are only 2 reactors operating, so now it's more something like 1 or 2%. So you have already managed to prove that you can technically do without nuclear in Japan. And surprisingly, many haven't realized that. I was interviewed by NHK in early June, and the reporter asked me, when do you think Japan can do without nuclear? And I said, today? And she was looking like this and said, oh yeah, right. So it has happened, but the way it has happened has not been the economically most efficient. Japan is now importing liquefied natural gas at a rate that was unpredicted. There is not enough transport capacity, or there is a shortage of transport capacity, so gas transport is extremely expensive, and Japan is paying a lot of money for this sudden reduction in nuclear power production and substitution with gas. So unlike Germany, where this renewable increase and the decrease of nuclear has matched, so that they have increased renewables more than they have closed nuclear, Japan has had a rather sudden drop in nuclear capacity. So you would have to either have a very sudden increase in renewables, which will be difficult, or sort of take it slowly and step by step reduce the use of fossil fuels now, which will make it very obvious and visible the benefits of increasing renewables. And the renewable potentials in Japan are sufficient. I heard now again people complaining about the lack of land in Japan, but just covering simply all buildings in solar PV would give a lot of electricity, and there are some calculations, some different assumptions on how large share of the building stock would be available and so on. And this is the kind of systems that will evolve globally, that you will use solar PVs instead of other roof and wall materials. The extra cost for that will be very small and the profitability will be very large, but you need to learn to do it. And the wind power potential in Japan and along the Japanese coast are significant. The potential for geothermal are also magnificent here compared to most other countries in the world. So there are large opportunities, but it will be a few years to learn how to use it. And you can speed it up by being open to learning and to products from abroad. I see a little problem with a Japanese industrial tradition saying we should do it all ourselves. Try to take the opportunity to learn from the best manufacturers in the world, import products, compare with what is produced in Japan, and try to develop efficiency even further. You don't have to start from the beginning in Japan and develop domestic wind power industries immediately. Did I miss something?
My name is Jacob. I come from Tanzania. In thinking about far future of renewable energies and the environment, are there any possible threats to the environment?
Yes. As I said, there are possibilities of, say, misusing renewable energy technologies so that they do cause unnecessary damage. But the difference between renewables and non-renewables is that with renewables they are avoidable. But still you have to be wise. I mean, you can imagine biomass systems where you cut down forest and burn it for energy purposes without replanting. It would be unsustainable, but you could claim that the biomass resource is still renewable but not renewed. You can imagine building wind power plants in very bad locations in ugly way that's unnecessarily harmful, but it's very difficult to cause a real catastrophe by wind power plants. Solar panels, the threats there are in the production of solar panels. It's a production process that needs to be properly managed to avoid local pollution, but it's not very difficult to avoid, but you need to avoid it. And in a very long-term, perspective scenario, you also need to ensure that you have some sort of recycling to reuse the materials. We haven't got much experience of that because so far it seems that the solar PV panels have a lifetime that's so long that they haven't really began to come into the phase when they are scrapped yet. But thinking about recycling when developing solar PV systems is quite important, and I know that many of the large companies do so now because they realize this will be a long-term issue. Geothermal also, it's a matter of making sure that when you build power plants, you build them so that they fit in the local environment and community, which may result in very different solutions in different places. I've heard here in Japan that some people are worried that geothermal systems will threaten local tourism. And at the same time, we know from Iceland, which is a country with a very high per capita utilization of geothermal energy, that the largest tourist attraction on Iceland is a bath called the Blue Lagoon, which almost every tourist who visit Iceland visit the Blue Lagoon, and it's it's a part of the large geothermal power plant for the capital city. So there are opportunities, but there are risks. But I'm not too worried; they can be handled.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and Nico from the Philippines.
Just to touch off on your point about, first of all, learning from mistakes. I've only been here a month, but I'm well aware of what happened during the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And I'm wondering why. The shift from nuclear to renewable forms is maybe not as, or the momentum is not as strong as I would expect it after what happened last year. Maybe is this possibly because the effects of the nuclear disaster have not been publicly documented, which is actually what brings me to my question. Maybe could you shed some light on the actual data as regards to Tokyo itself? How is the city being affected by what happened? And is it being properly reported? And if not, I'm just thinking this is possibly why it's taking a more difficult turn into shifting from to other forms of nuclear, other forms of renewable energy.
Right. I think you're bringing up some extremely important issues, because the effects of the radiation or the radioactive contamination that is the result of the Fukushima accident should really be carefully examined, because this is the kind of knowledge that you can't test by experiment, because you can't expose people to radioactive contamination in order to learn how dangerous it is. The opportunities you have to learn is when a disaster like this happens, and then you should be really taking this opportunity to learn. And historically, human society has failed. There were opportunities in connection with the nuclear weapons tests. There were opportunities with the Chernobyl accident, but in these cases, the research and the data has not been particularly impressive. And one reason for that is that the people who are in charge are the people who were also in charge of taking all the decisions that led to the disaster. And when you started your question without getting into the issues of the health effects, that is also a problem in any policy institution like the government ministries and so on, that it's manned with people who have been designing the strategies and projects that now have proven to be less good. And they do not immediately want to say, oh, we were all wrong, let's do something different. They tend to defend what they once decided. And that is also a problem when it comes to now acknowledging and evaluating what are the health effects. That usually the people who are now supposed to do that are the people who were involved in the nuclear program development, setting up safety rules, taking the decisions after the accident on where to evacuate and where not to evacuate. And if you're responsible for not evacuating someone, you don't think it's very important to show that they're actually being killed. That's not your top priority. So there are inherent differences in getting good science to work in this in such a situation. And we can see here, as well as in Europe and elsewhere after the Chernobyl accident, that there were individual professors of physics, usually people who were not directly involved in the radiophysics, the risk analysis and so on, who did a fantastic job in informing the public in an objective, correct way, whilst those who had been involved and had a formal responsibility were less honest and open and good at providing information. So that it's indeed a problem.
Okay. That's good.
My name is Nakano from Social Science Research Institute, and my question is, when we look at history, we have chosen energy in aiming at unlimited growth. So my question is, what types of economy do we need to introduce renewable energy?
So what did you say? We did not have energy enough for...
No. When we look at history, we have
Yeah.
always chosen a type of energy in assuming, in aiming at unlimited economy.
Okay, yeah.
So what types of economy should be constructed
Yeah.
based on renewable energy?
Right. I think I would like to disagree a little. I don't think that we have chosen sources of energy that can supply unlimited growth. I mean, it's obvious that the global oil resources cannot sustain unlimited growth. It's obvious that coal cannot or uranium cannot. They're all exhaustibles. They are limited, so they cannot sustain infinite growth. And when I have been working in China, which I now described how they have become the world leader in renewable energy, this is the very challenge that they have realized and tried to address. When the Chinese leaders, in preparing their 5-year plan now, were saying we want to continue economic growth by 5, 10, 15% until 2020, we realized that if we succeed, our energy demand will grow dramatically. And we do not have domestic coal, oil and gas and uranium resources sufficiently for this, so we will need to increase our imports of oil, gas and even coal. And then they look out in the world and they realize that if China is increasing its oil imports by a few 100%, the world market price for oil will skyrocket. And if that happens, of course, it will feed back into the Chinese growth ambitions, lower growth. But they did also realize that when that happens, it's important to have the world's most energy efficient industries. And the Chinese were happily acknowledging when checking that Chinese process industry on average was often the most efficient in the world because it was built in the last 5 years. So coal-fired power stations in China on average are more efficient than coal-fired power stations in Europe because they're newer and more modern. And similarly for some of the other process industries, the Chinese said, oh, right, we are already best, but we want to be even better, but we're already ahead. So they did see that this would benefit the Chinese industry, but still the growth would not be as dramatic as if they were not dependent on fossil fuels. So they say, okay, but let's go for these renewables, because with economic growth we can even just build more solar panels and more wind power plants. There is nothing that makes it more expensive. The learning curve experience would even suggest that if we build more solar panels, the price of solar panels will decrease and the cost of energy would decrease and our growth would be even faster. So for China, with their ambitions of fast economic growth for almost 1.5 billion people, renewables are much more attractive than fossil fuels or nuclear. So when you said that you have been selecting energy sources that would fit economic growth, I said, no, fossil fuels are not fit for global growth. It's useful for a few countries can get a high living standards, but not for everyone. But renewables can provide for economic prosperity for everyone.
But that means we are still in modern civilization.
I do think so. And the way I've heard it described in China, we have in Europe so this sustainable development concept. In China, they're talking about scientific development, harmonious society, and ecological civilization. And the ecological civilization concept includes a lot of this recycling of materials and renewable energy that will provide for real global prosperity for a large number of people. So I think the transforming society from being dependent on non-renewable sources like fossil fuels and uranium into reliance on renewables will provide the opportunity for economic prosperity for most of the people on Earth, unlike the previous kinds of energy system.
Because he's studying French thought on
Yeah.
the growth.
Yeah.
But I think that economic growth is not always same as economic prosperity.
No. There are many different alternative economic growth scenarios with very different real wealth and happiness. So you can play a lot with these different definitions.
Okay. Last question.
Yes. It's a bit off map, but what do you think about hydroelectric power? Like recently there's a very controversial plant construction in Brazil.
Yeah.
And I would like to know your opinion
Yeah.
about that.
I come from a country with a lot of hydropower. About half our electricity supply is from hydropower. The hydropower plants were built mainly in the early mid-20th century. They were built in largely unpopulated areas with very little vegetation. So the main negative effect was biological effects such as fish movements being restricted and similarly. Continued operations of such hydropower plants is usually among the best options compared to any other alternative new electricity supply. But when you come to more densely populated areas on Earth, you often have a lot of social implications with people having to move. You may have significant environmental effects when it comes to nutrients and soil movements in relation to agriculture. And in some countries, you're like Brazil, you're also reducing the amount of forested land and biodiversity of forest. And in some cases, you may also have a negative effect on greenhouse gas emissions, because when you build a dam that will cover forests or coal-rich soils, you're likely to get methane production from this biomass. So you get emissions of methane, which is a very strong greenhouse gas. So you can even challenge the hydropower plants from a greenhouse gas perspective, which is not what was discussed in Sweden when we developed our hydropower system, because we didn't have the biomass volumes that you have in other parts of the world, and the greenhouse gas emissions was not a big issue then. So today, I think the potential for a really desirable, sustainable hydropower expansion is not very big compared to the potential for modern renewables and biomass, which is often a better alternative. I saw one other calculation. There was a hydropower plant built in Ghana in Africa, and it was afterwards calculated that if you had used the area that you dammed for biomass production, for biomass-based electricity generation, you could have got more electricity per year than from the hydropower plant. So I would not point at hydropower as a large global potential for increase. Wind and solar has a large potential, but in some systems you are very keen to have hydropower because you can control power production much better than from solar and wind, and therefore the value of the electricity would be very high.
Thank you very much, because at that time is limited. Next class will start at 3:10, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.